Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara Seidler.
I'm Billi FitzSimons.
Earlier this week, media outlets reported that women and children connected to ISIS had attempted to flee a detention camp and return to Australia. It's reignited a national conversation about the role of the government in this specific scenario and whether or not these citizens should be allowed to return to Australia. In today's podcast, we're going to explain what we know about the journey of these people, what the arguments for and against are, and what could come next.
Zara, when I saw this story earlier this week, I was confused because I swear a similar thing had happened a couple of years ago. Yeah. It's quite a complex story. So I think we should start by, I'm sure many of our listeners are very familiar with ISIS. They are in the news a lot. They are a terrorist organization.
But I'd say less so than they used to be.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
But I think we should start by explaining what that group is.
Yeah, okay. So ISIS is a group that Australia's listed as a terrorist organisation since 2005. From 2014 to 2017, they controlled roughly a third of Syria, and they formed what they called a caliphate, which is essentially a self-declared state governed under a fundamentalist interpretation of Islamic law. And it's during that time that we heard about a number of attacks that were carried out in the name of ISIS. You know, here in Australia, we had the Link Cafe siege. That was done in the name of ISIS. And so during that peak, I guess, of their power, there were thousands and thousands of citizens from countries around the world who decided to leave their home countries to go and fight with ISIS to establish this caliphate. And this group actually included quite a few Australians. And so there are Australians who left this country to go over to Syria and fight, and they were trained and recruited. Many of those people we know have since died, but we're talking about it today because of the families of those people.
And just to go back, you were just talking about the Lynch siege, and you said before that they're probably less powerful now than they were about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I would say about 10 years ago, there were a string of terrorist attacks, and they seem to just keep coming up, keep happening. And it was a really terrifying time. But now, like you said, they are definitely less powerful, right?
I mean, on paper, they are definitely less powerful. So ISIS lost all of its land by 2019. So when we talk about their physical presence, they had this land in Syria and they no longer operate that land. But it should be said that, for example, the Bondi terrorist attack, those suspects had ISIS flags in their bags. And so, you know, while the kind of really constant occurrences of terrorist attacks done in the name of ISIS have certainly diminished, there is still this ideological binding and the power that this group has. But as I said, the majority of that land was lost by 2019. And when that happened, many of ISIS's fighters and their families were put into detention camps. So those detention camps were in Syria, Libya, and Iraq. And just an interesting thing that I saw was that a lot of these people were actually put in detention centers with the victims of who they had been fighting. It's really interesting and says a lot about some of the tensions that exist there. But there were dozens and dozens of these sorts of camps. And as we said earlier, there had been Australian citizens who had gone over to travel. And so invariably, we have Australians in those detention camps. Some were fighters, but then others were actually the wives and partners of those who had travelled to join them. And then there were the children who had either, again, travelled to be with their parents or had been born during the time where these people had been fighting for ISIS. And so we have a situation where there have been some Australian children who have been born in these detention centres or camps and have never been to Australia, but actually are Australian citizens.
And so then to bring it to the news this week, it is the wives and children of these ISIS fighters who are also Australian citizens that we are talking about with the news this week.
Correct. So multiple outlets reported that a group of 34 Australian women and children attempted to leave a detention camp called Al-Roj in northeastern Syria this week. So they've been held there for 7 years. And as we understand it, they got around 50 kilometres into their journey towards Damascus, the capital of Syria, before they were turned around by Syrian authorities. A camp official told the Sydney Morning Herald that the group's departure had been postponed because of something like Syrian government permissions, and therefore they weren't successful in actually getting out. But it has reignited this discussion of, should they get out, what happens then? Should they be allowed to return to Australia?
Okay, so these are Australian women and children who are trying to leave a Syrian detention camp where they have been for a number of years.
Yeah.
But my understanding from the news this week is that the Australian government said, we will not help you leave these camps.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the federal government has said that they are not involved in the attempted return. We had Prime Minister Anthony Albanese say, we have a very firm view that we won't be providing assistance or repatriation. He added that these people were people who went overseas supporting ISIS. And he argues, therefore, that they should not be allowed to return home. And secondly, that the government should not have to play a role in getting these people home.
Okay, Zara, so we just heard the perspective of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, who said that the Australian government will not be assisting in the return of these Australian women and children who are in the camp.
Yeah.
Are there any opinions from other politicians who believe that they should be allowed back in?
Hey, I'm Sam. I'm the co-founder of TDA. With one button, 82% of you who aren't subscribed to this YouTube channel can change that and help Australian media. Click subscribe. Now back to the video.
I want to let me go back one step because, I mean, nothing's as neat as there being two sides, but I want to just talk you through some of the arguments for and against this. Because, yes, Anthony Albanese is one of the people who has said that he doesn't think that they should be helped by the Australian government. He said something like, if you make your bed, you lie in it. So he's saying they chose to go over there and thus they are not allowed to come back.
Although the children didn't.
Well, I mean, okay, I'll skip to the other side of the opinion, which says that, and this is something that's particularly been echoed by human rights groups who say there have been examples of family violence and coercion where these women were not using free will when they went over to Syria, that perhaps there could have been instances where they were forced by their partners to travel over, and that they should then, as a kind of humanitarian case, be able to return and should not be blamed for the decisions of their partners, many of whom have since died. Another reason why people think that these people should be allowed to return is that children should not bear responsibility for their parents' choices. So as we just said, that some of these children were born in detention. If you are a 3, 4, 5-year-old, the argument is that you should not be held responsible for what your father, who has since died, did, or your mother for that matter. There have also been arguments that it is a kind of legal imperative for the Australian government to intervene. But from both of the major parties, we have heard, no, we are not going to intervene. We are not going to help. These people cannot be brought back. And most of the underpinnings of that argument is safety, that is a national security threat to Australia.
Because they could have been radicalised within those camps.
Or during their time in Syria. Like, these people were, some of them, married to ISIS fighters. Perhaps they were radicalised even before they left. You know, we're not going to go into individual cases, but there is an argument to be made about the level of radicalisation that some of these people might have had.
Is there any precedent for the Australian government helping people like the wives of ISIS fighters, allowing them back into Australia?
Yeah, this is really challenging because... Okay, so there are 2 cases where women and children from these ISIS camps have been brought back to Australia. However, the role of the government and the role that the government played in bringing them home hasn't been entirely clear. So there are 2 examples, one under Scott Morrison and one under Anthony Albanese. So under Scott Morrison in 2019, 8 Australian children from Syria were assisted to leave a camp and return back to Australia. I don't know if you remember this. There was a Four Corners episode about it, of a grandmother going to get her grandchildren back. These were the children of Khaled Sharoof and Tara Nettleton. I don't know if listeners will be familiar with Khaled Sharoof, but his children were pictured holding a beheaded or a severed head in one photograph, and he was often deemed kind of the worst of Australia's exports to ISIS. So under the Morrison government, the children were brought home by their grandmother. We don't know what role Scott Morrison's government actually played in getting them out, whether they assisted or whether they were, instrumental in bringing them home. And then in 2022, under Anthony Albanese, 4 Australian women and their 13 children returned to Australia. At the time, Home Affairs Minister Tony Burke said, if any of those people find their own way to return, our security agencies are satisfied that they are prepared and will be able to act in the interests of community safety. So he's kind of using language there that suggests that the Albanese government didn't repatriate them, but that they won't stop them when they get to Australia. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense.
It's a bit finicky because it's happened and then governments have backtracked and said, no, we didn't actually play a role in this. We just didn't stop it.
And so basically it's up to individual governments as opposed to there being one law that deals with this?
Yeah, so it's been tested in a court. So I don't know if you've heard of a charity called Save the Children.
Yes.
Yeah, so they took the federal government, the Albanese government, to court and said that the Home Affairs Minister needed to repatriate Australian women and children. Repatriate just means bring home. And ultimately, they lost this case because the court found Australia does not have a legal obligation to repatriate the women and children because it does not control the circumstances of their detention. So that's what the court says. And so, yeah, you're right. Like there can be a decision to more actively or more passively help, but the courts have found that it is not a requirement per se.
Okay, so where does this leave us? The brides and children will just stay in the Syrian camp?
Well, we understand that there is an effort for the people who at the beginning of the week tried to flee, that they might do it again later this week. There's not been any confirmation, so we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But it does look like neither Labor nor the coalition are particularly keen to play any role in getting these people out of that Syrian detention camp. And so it is likely that unless there is something that happens outside of the government realm, these people will remain in these detention camps and not back in Australia.
A very complicated case, Zara. Thank you for taking us through that.
Thank you, Billi.
And thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Daily Aus. We'll be back this afternoon with your evening headlines, but until then, we hope you have a lovely day.